Hey everyone, tonight we're journeying back to the plains before the walls of Troy. But tonight's tale peels back the silver screen to reveal what really happened, not what Hollywood shows us, because the version you've seen on film is full of sweeping romance and single-night sieges. It's time to slow down and unpack the real, gritty, centuries-old truth buried beneath the legend. Battles fought over years, not days. Armies moved by sweat and grain, not instant montages. And decisions driven by politics and survival, not just the whims of a handsome prince. So, if you're expecting swords clashing in glorified slow motion or a lone hero charging through a gate, you might want to brace yourself for a different rhythm. This story unfolds in dusty archives and shattered pottery shards, not in green screen vistas. And after all, the goal here is to fall asleep. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love the story. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Tomorrow, come back and tell me which part of the story you fell asleep during. I'd really love to know. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The World Before the War. Tonight, we drift back 4 millennia, to a world of bronze sails cutting through deep blue seas and sun-baked palaces perched on rocky hilltops. Imagine a breeze carrying the scent of goats and olive oil, drifting across markets piled high with copper trinkets, fragrant incense, and jars of wild honey. In that world, 2 great powers ruled the eastern Mediterranean: the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland and the city of Troy, Wilusa in its own tongue, on the far side of the Aegean. Both were wealthy, confident, and proud, yet neither could foresee how swiftly rumor and ambition would sweep them into a war that would echo through the ages. On the shores of Argolis, near the palaces of Mycenae and Pylos, life unfolded in a choreographed rhythm of palace officials, temple priests, and workers at vast workshops. Beneath massive cyclopean walls, a boy named Leandros clambered over smooth stones, delivering freshly woven wool to his uncle's pottery kilns. His uncle looked up at him, copper torque catching the morning light, and assigned him another task: fetching fresh eggs for the potter's midday meal. Leandros dreamed of someday joining the palace guard, of polishing his own bronze breastplate until it gleamed, of riding chariots in the king's procession. He could almost feel the statue like calm of the Wanax or king as he descended marble steps to greet foreign envoys. Across the rolling hills and olive groves of the Troad, Ileona helped her mother press olives into oil, her bare feet sticky with crushed fruit. She listened to sailors' tales of distant storms and imagined sailing past cerulean cliffs toward lands no Trojan girl had ever seen. Yet her grandmother, bent and wise, whispered cautionary notes. "Powerful friends can turn into hidden foes," she said, brushing a strand of silvery hair from Ileona's forehead. "Keep your eyes open for gifts wrapped in gold." In villages and palaces alike, religion permeated every moment. At dawn in Mycenae, Leandros saw priests burning frankincense on altars to Athena, the city's protector. Women offered libations of wine to Demeter before baking barley bread, hoping for fertile fields. In Troy, priests chanted hymns to Apollo beneath mural-painted chambers. Each god was woven into daily life. Poseidon, whose tremors rattled palace doorways, was honored with sea foam libations. Hera, whose favor cemented royal marriages, was invoked in bride chants. When a child fell ill, parents borrowed healing charms carved in ivory. When storms uprooted olive trees, villagers left bronze arrow offerings in rock pools. Trade carried more than goods. It carried ideas, songs, and rumors across the Aegean. In Mycenae, shipwrights loaded timber from Corinth, clay vessels from Crete, and tin from Iberian mines. Across the waves, Trojan merchants bartered wool for amber from Baltic shores and exchanged fine Anatolian silver for storied weapons. In Miletus and Ephesus, itinerant bards sang of Paris's fateful choice, long before Homer would set quill to papyrus. Verses drifted from taverns to temple courts, evolving with each retelling. A single stanza could spark laughter at a festive banquet or send a chill of foreboding through palace corridors. One autumn day, news arrived at Mycenae that Troy's princes had seized a Mycenaean merchant vessel laden with bronze ingots. A trader named Doran, his cloak stained with sea salt, pleaded before the palace council for justice. He claimed the Trojans hailed him as a friend, then turned on him once his cargo was in their docks. Some elders argued this was a simple case of mistaken identity. Others whispered of deliberate provocation, to test Greek patience or weaken their metal stores. King Atreus' sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus, listened in grim silence. Their mother, who embroidered gold-threaded tapestries in the women's quarters, paused her shuttle, sensing the first tremors of upheaval. On the northern coast of Troy, Ileona and her elder brother Deiphobus carried oil jars down to the city's harbor. They watched longshoremen unload ivory combs from Sicily and fragrant cedar beams from Lebanon. A merchant's slave told of a Greek fleet poised at Aulis. 30 sails at least, he said, voice lowered, keen as falcons, ready to strike. Deiphobus spat into the dust. They will never land here, he said, thumbed at a painted sherd depicting Athena's owl. Ileona shrank back when a guard seized the slave, dragging him to shadows beyond the quays. The oil jars shattered in the scuffle, and the pale green oil seeped into cracks between stones, mixing with the guard's blood. Yet even amid tension, daily routines carried on. In Mycenaean workshops, potters shaped amphorae destined for wine or oil. Carpenters in Troy shaped clubfoot stools and relief-carved doors of polished sycamore. In both realms, textile workers spun wool dyed scarlet with madder root. Leandros's mother hummed lullabies in a courtyard where women ground barley into flour, while Ileona's cousin learned to carve graffiti on pottery shards. A heart and 2 initials, scratched deep enough to endure the ages. Seasonal cycles shaped both preparation and expectation. Winter's rains swelled mountain springs, flooding low-lying fields but replenishing cisterns. Mycenaean peasants sowed barley in wet furrows. Trojan shepherds guided flocks across high pastures, seeking fresh grass. With spring came days of sun-blazed training. Warriors in Mycenae practiced thrusts with bronze-tipped spears, sandals kicking up red dust in sun-dappled courtyards. Trojan youths hurled javelins at moving targets. Fashioned from pottery shards, laughter echoing under vaulted archways. Girls in both cities wove decorative bands into woolen cloaks, their fingers nimble as they passed stories from mother to daughter. How a wooden horse toppled walls, how gods fought beside men, how honor was everything. But beneath that laughter, a growing sense of dread murmured through both societies. In Mycenae's palace, Agamemnon summoned chieftains from the great council hall, where stone benches circled a bronze-inlaid hearth. Torches flickered against carved reliefs of lions and bulls. Agamemnon's voice sounded muffled beneath his gold helmet. He praised loyalty but spoke of necessity. We cannot allow our trade to be snatched from our hands. We cannot let our oaths to one another ring hollow. Mycenaeans rose from benches in murmur-filled agreement. They grasped each other's forearms in the grip of sworn brothers. Meanwhile, in Troy, word spread that Helen, the greatest beauty in Greece, had spent a season in Sparta. A messenger hastened through oak groves bearing a sealed letter from Menelaus, demanding Helen's return and, with it, a Trojan pledge to respect Mycenaean honor. Priests in Troy's grand temple debated whether to accept the letter as a diplomatic query or an ultimatum. The high priest cautioned that dishonoring a Greek king could invite a coalition of armies. Others urged caution. "Helen is not our hostage," one voice said. "We owe no allegiance to Menelaus's house." Under vaulted ceilings, heated words nearly exploded into violence before elders smoothed jagged edges with promises of further debate. Beyond these high chambers, rumor carried tales of small raids along coastal villages. Mycenaean skiffs, under cover of moonlight, landed scouts who tried to map Troy's sea walls. Trojan fishermen reported hearing voices in the night, echoing with alien tongues. Once, a small Greek raiding party attacked a vineyard near the Scaean Gate, leaving marks on olive wheels and dragging away 2 aging shepherds for questioning. They returned 3 days later, shaken and mute, but clutching scraps of letters written in unfamiliar Mycenaean script. Geography itself conspired to raise the stakes. The plain of Ilium was backed by the fortress-topped Acropolis, its lower slopes thick with olive and oak. A sudden storm could wash away embankments, block supply routes, and strand ships on rocky shoals. Supply trains of oxen coursed over mountain passes that turned to mud in spring. When drought gripped the coast, wells ran dry and tempers flared. 100 miles to the west, the Argolids' gentle contours allowed Mycenaean chariots to race across open fields, but only if enemy spies didn't spot them coming. Still, in the lull before fair winds and marching drums, the human spirit shone through. In Mycenae, Leandros joined a troupe of traveling musicians who performed laments on bronze lyres, weaving tales of gods who sang mortals to their fates. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair, taught him a chorus he'd later hum in moments of fear. In Troy, Iliona found solace in the temple gardens where night-blooming flowers released white petals onto mossy stones. There, she recited prayers to Eos, goddess of dawn, asking for light to scatter the shadows gathering in her heart. As winter turned to spring, the Mycenaean fleet finally gathered at Aulis. 30 sails gleamed like silver fish before storm clouds, hulls rising and falling in choreographed rhythm. Rowers, seasoned seamen and palace conscripts alike, pulled oars in unison, voices chanting a solemn dirge. Fresh sacrifices of oxen stained the shore crimson, and priests invoked Artemis to grant fair winds and valiant hearts. Leandros stood among them, his fingers numb around the haft of his spear, his breath visible in the cold air. He felt both terror and exhilaration. For the first time, he was part of something vast, something he could neither fully understand nor escape. Across the Aegean, Iliona watched from the ramparts of Troy as the fleet vanished into mist. She pressed her cheek against cold stone, straining to catch the sound of distant trumpets or the faint splash of oars. A chill wind ruffled her hair, carrying mist from the sea. She shivered and drew her cloak tighter, wondering whether those ships carried merchants laden with silver or warriors hungering for blood. That night, beneath a full moon, the high priest of Troy lit a circle of fire at the edge of the inner courtyard. He scattered barley and salt into the flames, whispering prayers to Poseidon, lord of the sea, and Athena, protector of cities. Iliona's grandmother knelt beside him, her trembling hands cupped over the sparks, her lips moving so softly they were almost silent. Keep our walls standing, she whispered. Keep our people here. Somewhere far across the waves, deep within Mycenae's palace, Agamemnon raised his goblet of wine to the memory of his ancestors. The braided rim gleamed under torchlight. He spoke a vow he knew would bind his followers. We sail for honor, for Helen, and for every Mycenaean whose voice is stilled by Trojan hands. A hush fell, broken only by the scrape of armor and the low murmur of souls steeled for war. Stories traveled faster than bronze ships, but they rarely carried the full truth. Even now, in this prelude of oaths and offerings, the seeds of legend were sprouting. Bards would later place gods on battlefields, crown heroes with immortal glory, and transform whispered rumors into epic verse. But the real world was a tangle of politics, ambition, fear, and duty, where every gift might hide a dagger, and every promise could shatter like a fragile jar beneath marching feet. For Ileona, the war was a distant thunder, heard but not yet felt in her bones. For Leandros, it was the first spark of an adventure he hoped would make him a hero. Neither knew the price they would pay, nor how homes would burn, walls would crumble, and families would scatter like wounded birds. When dawn breaks over this ancient landscape, the drums of war will begin, and the real story of Troy will diverge from every movie you've ever seen. Chapter 2. The Spark, Paris, Helen, and a Royal Abduction. The sun rose pale over Mount Taygetus the morning Paris stepped ashore in Sparta. He had left Ilium under cover of darkness, cloaked in a traveler's garb woven from rough wool. His heart pounded not from fear of Spartan guards, but from anticipation of the court that awaited him. Rumor had preceded him that Menelaus, brother of the mighty Agamemnon, ruled this land with stern justice, that his queen, Helen, was a woman of such beauty the gods themselves paused to admire her. For Paris, Prince of Troy, this journey would prove the turning point of his life, and the first chapter of a war few could yet imagine. Paris's boat ground against the sandy cove just before dawn. A handful of local fishermen, nets coiled at their feet, blinked at the stranger's pale face and foreign accent. They glanced toward the palace gates, high on a rocky spur, where torches flickered like distant stars. A herald approached, bearing a bronze-rimmed staff, and demanded Paris's name, origin, and purpose. Paris offered a scrap of Troy's royal seal, a small clay cylinder inscribed with Ilian script. The herald studied it, then nodded once and escorted Paris up the narrow road. Along the way, Paris saw olive groves stretching like quilted fields, their leaves silvered in early light. He passed markets where traders from Cyprus and Crete hawked figs, grapes, and amphorae of oil. The air carried the tang of salt and the sharp scent of crushed herbs. Slaves moved silently, carrying water jars to temple shrines. Servants in dyed tunics held leashed hunting dogs, greyhounds with sleek flanks and pointed ears. At the palace threshold, 2 guards stopped Paris. Their bronze greaves caught the sun, and their shields bore the red crest of Menelaus's house. "State your business?" one barked. Paris bowed low and spoke of an embassy bearing gifts and goodwill from Troy's king Priam. He presented a casket of carved ivory inlaid with gold, an ancient Trojan heirloom made by Aegean craftsmen. The guards glanced at each other, then relented. "You may enter," the second said, voice low but firm. Inside, a high colonnade opened onto a marble courtyard where fountains trickled into mosaic pools. Slender columns supported a cobalt-blue roof, painted with scenes of lion hunts and oak leaf garlands. Ivory-draped chairs lined the long walls. At the far end, under a gilded canopy, sat Menelaus and Helen, flanked by royal advisors. Menelaus's scarlet cloak spilled onto the marble floor. His beard was carefully trimmed, his eyes sharp as an eagle's. Beside him, Helen reclined on a cushioned throne, her hair black as night and skin pale like ivory. She wore a gown of spun linen dyed rose pink, cinched at the waist with a belt of pearls. Menelaus rose as Paris approached. "Son of Priam," he said, voice courteous but guarded, "you honor us with your presence. Yet rumor claims this visit conceals another purpose. Speak now." Paris set down his gifts and raised his chin. "King of Sparta, I come in peace and friendship. My father seeks alliance, not conflict. And yet, the matter of the golden apple," he paused, glancing at Helen, "weighs upon me. You know the tale. 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, asked me to judge their beauty. Aphrodite promised me the fairest woman in all the world for my choice. I accepted her gift in good faith. If my affection for this woman offends you, let me explain." Helen's lips curved in a faint smile. She reached for a cup of wine offered by a servant. "Tell us," she murmured, voice soft as woven silk. Paris recounted his encounter on Mount Ida. How Hera had offered him power over all of Asia, how Athena had promised wisdom and victory in battle, but how Aphrodite's promise to deliver him the love of Helen of Sparta had swayed him. He described the vision of her face, the warmth in his chest when her name was spoken, and his certainty that the gods had guided him. Menelaus listened, fingers tapping a carved armrest. When Paris finished, the Spartan king spoke. "My wife does not belong to the whims of judges or gods. Helen is queen of Sparta by right, by marriage, and by her own will. If Aphrodite claims her, she must answer to me and to the oaths sworn among kings." A murmur rippled through the hall. Paris bowed his head. "I bear no lord's scepter. My love for Helen is true. I ask only for asylum in Troy, and for the chance to prove that her happiness is worth any consequence." Helen set down her cup and rose, silks whispering against marble. She approached Paris with measured steps, each echo a heartbeat in the hushed chamber. "I am a queen no less than any man's wife," she said. "My heart belongs where it finds peace. If my marriage to Menelaus brings me sorrow, then no oath can bind me to it." She reached out and brushed her fingers along Paris's sleeve. "I choose to go with you." Her words stunned the assembly. A servant gasped and dropped a tray of ornate goblets, shards tinkling like faint bells. Menelaus's face paled. Advisors shuffled papers, eyes darting to the entrance where soldiers waited. One of Menelaus's trusted counselors, aged and wise, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he said, voice soft, "this matter cannot be resolved in folly. Helen is under Sparta's protection." Menelaus covered his face with one hand. He paced in front of his throne. "Sparta will not stand for this," he finally snapped. "My honor is pledged to her safety. If you take her, Paris, you declare war on me and on every king who swore the oath of Tyndareus." At that, the herald summoned Sparta's allied chieftains. Leaders from Crete, Messenia, and Thessaly, each bound by the oath of Tyndareus. Many of these kings had courted Helen before Menelaus did, then relinquished their claims for peace. They had sworn an oath, echoed a generation later by their sons and nephews, to defend her chosen husband against any wrong. Now that oath crackled in the hall like dry tinder. Chiefs rose one by one, hands laid on the bronze-inlaid chests of their armor. Each swore to uphold Menelaus's cause, to gather their ships, and to bring Helen home by sword or by siege. They knew that to break the oath was to invite the wrath of Zeus himself. yet none relished sending chieftains and spearmen across the Aegean to Troy's strong walls. Word of Helen's flight spread across the Mycenaean world in days. Messengers on horseback galloped along mountain passes. Heralds shouted proclamations in crowded agoras. At Pylos, King Nestor raised a banner over his palace gates, calling for volunteers. At Mycenae, Agamemnon summoned the great council beneath the carved lions. He spoke of honor, of sacred oaths, and of the necessity to defend Menelaus, his brother and king. Our alliances bind us, Agamemnon declared. We must not let Troy's princes spit upon these bonds. Smoke by the sea marked the gathering of ships at Aulis. 40 war galleys formed lines like schools of sharks, oars rising and falling in twilight drills. Rowers chanted in unison, some veteran sailors, others pressed conscripts. For honor, for Helen, for Sparta. Bronze helmets gleamed among the ranks. Sailors stocked wood for rams, hides for decking, and rope woven from hemp grown on Samos. Back in Troy, a shadow fell over the great city. Priam, hearing of Helen's arrival, summoned Paris to the royal court. Priam's voice trembled with age and sorrow as he spoke of the consequences. "My son," he said, "you have invited destruction, yet I cannot turn my back on you or on Helen. She is a guest in our halls. Our hospitality is sacred, but prepare yourself. The sons of Achaeans will cross the sea for her." Before the first ship even sailed, Trojan envoys hastened to Anatolian courts, seeking allies and mercenaries. In Hattusa, the Hittite king received polished silver and promises of grain shipments in exchange for archers skilled with composite bows. In Lycia, local lords discreetly agreed to supply charioteers, seasoned fighters who knew mountain passes and ambush tactics. Each alliance cost Troy jewels, slaves, and green-tinted glass vials from Egyptian traders. Meanwhile, Greek spies slipped into Troy disguised as wandering dancers and traders. They carried coins stamped with Mycenaean seals, hoping to pass as legitimate merchants. They mapped the city's walls, counted the number of watchtower gates, and recorded daily patrol routes. At night, they slipped notes back to Greek captains hidden in hollow reeds, tied with strands of wool. In Sparta, Helen wandered palace corridors, restless under golden lantern light. She traced her fingers over painted frescoes showing Heracles' labors and Achilles' deeds. She wondered whether her choice would bring her true happiness or doom her people. She confided to her maid, a woman named Leda, who had served her since childhood. "I regret nothing," Helen said quietly, "but fear stirs in my chest." Leda held her hand. "The heart must answer to itself," she whispered. As spring ripened fields of barley and orchards blazed with almond blossoms, the Greek fleet set sail. Dawn saw the torches extinguished, and a great cheer rose from Aulis as ships moved eastward, 20 miles off the coast. They formed a crescent shape to protect against sudden storm squalls. Scouts unfurled canvas sails dyed crimson, catching the wind that would carry them toward Troy's towers. In Troy, Ileona watched from a watchtower atop the Acropolis. She saw white-flecked waves on the horizon, like broken gems in the sea. Her heart galloped as she recognized the shape of Greek triremes, their 3 tiers of oars, their ram bows carved in the form of bulls. She knew her brother Deiphobus waited below to sound the alarm horn. She could see his figure moving among the battlements, shield slung across his back. Ileona closed her eyes and prayed to Hera, to Aphrodite, the very goddess who had set these events in motion. "Let peace find a window," she whispered to the dawn. "Let blood not stain these walls." But even as she spoke, a cold wind rushed through the tower. and the horizon shimmered with masts that carried war, not gifts. Hollywood would later show us Paris as a lovesick rogue, slipping into Sparta by magic or subterfuge, stealing Helen in a single bold move. They would skip over months of diplomacy, the sacred oaths, and the alliances forged in foreign courts. They would omit the Hittite archers, the Lycian charioteers, and the uneasy Greek spies who haunted Troy's streets. They would frame Helen's choice as a simple act of romance instead of a collision of honor cultures, divine promises, and political necessity. Yet this spark, the promise of a goddess, the weight of oaths, the clash of royal wills, was anything but simple. It was a web of loyalties, of bargains struck in candlelit halls, of hidden emissaries and whispered warnings. In that world, love and war were inseparable. Every stolen glance could become a rallying cry, every broken promise a call to arms. Chapter 3. Encamped at Aulis. Prophecy, sacrifice, and delay. The Greek armada lay at anchor in the sheltered inlet of Aulis, its gleaming prows polished to a high shine beneath summer's sun. 30 triremes formed neat lines, their crimson sails furled against oak masts. Men scurried across gangplanks, carrying amphorae of wine, bundles of spears, and coils of hempen rope. Below deck, rowers tended blisters on their palms. Their bodies, lean from endless drills, glistened with oil as they flexed cramped limbs. Yet for all their preparation, the fleet lay stranded. Winds refused to fill their sails, and the shallow shoals barred their passage to Troy. For days, the sea lay calm as glass. The men waited in anxious silence, their chorus chants petering out. Captains conferred on deck beneath the hot sky, forehead creased against the sun. Agamemnon, radiant in a breastplate embossed with lions' heads, summoned a meeting of his highest officers. They gathered in a circle of stylites, wooden benches. Near a grove of fragrant myrtle, each chief spoke in turn. Some blamed Poseidon, god of the sea, angered by recent insults. Others whispered of Artemis's wrath, offended by Agamemnon's pride. Agamemnon listened patiently, expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice firm. We sail for Helen and for honor. No god shall stay our oars. Yet if we must appease a deity, let us learn which one, so that our sacrifices may bring wind to our sails. At that summons stepped Calchas, the fleet's most respected seer. Clad in linen stained with purple, his white hair fell to gaunt shoulders. His eyes, clouded with age yet piercing, surveyed the captains. He cleared his throat and spoke in measured tones. Agamemnon, he began, our delays are the doing of Artemis. You have slighted her temple at Broron, where your ships landed last season. A demand goes unanswered. A maiden of noble birth must be offered in her honor, so that she may grant us fair winds and safe passage. A hush fell. Some chieftains whispered that human sacrifice was a horror of old days, unthinkable in civilized halls. Others nodded, recalling ancient myths of kings who had won battles only after offering virginal blood at sacred altars. Agamemnon's face darkened. He strode to the head of the circle and spat into the dust. You demand the daughter of my blood, my child, for the sake of wind and waves? He turned, jaw clenched, toward the grove where his eldest daughter, Iphigenia, waited unseen. Calchas nodded solemnly. Only such a gift will please Artemis, the seer said quietly. Without it, our sacrifices are empty, and our oars remain idle. That night, in a pavilion of embroidered linen, Agamemnon penned a letter to his queen, Clytemnestra. whose chambers glimmered with mirrored bronze and honey-colored tapestries. He wrote of a summons, a pretext of marriage between Iphigenia and Achilles, so that she might travel to Aulis unguarded. Clytemnestra's hand trembled as she read by candlelight. She touched the gold threads in the tapestry, braided with the likenesses of lions. Inside her, instinct warred with doubt. Was this a ploy, for union or a trap? By dawn, she had dispatched a maid to summon her daughter, cloaked in the promise of bridal adornment. On the beach at Aulis, the captive Iphigenia arrived beneath a canopy of silken veils. She was dressed in white robes edged with gold, her hair crowned with myrtle and olive. Achilles, hero of 100 raids, kneeled before her, offering a gilded necklace. Captains watched in awkward silence as she approached the altar. An elevated stone slab ringed with dripping bowls of blood. She glanced at Agamemnon, standing tall beneath his plumed helm, and back at Achilles, whose face was unreadable, beneath his bronze mask. Before the vows could be spoken, a low murmur erupted among the rowers. Some recognized the signs of sacrifice. Others recalled the swift death of another maiden at Aulis long ago. A murmur swelled into shouts. "No more blood!" cried one seasoned oarsman, voice cracking like dry wood. "We sailed to fight Troy, not slay innocent girls." Achilles sprang forward, sword drawn, but Agamemnon held up a hand. "Iphigenia's fate is the will of the goddess," he declared. "If we turn back now, our cause is lost, but if we proceed, we shall have wind and hope." Achilles lowered his blade with a muttered curse, and the rowers fell silent once more. With solemn rites, the priest drove the bronze blade deep into Iphigenia's breast. The chants rose, trembling and discordant, as blood pooled on the altar stones. When it was done, a sudden wind howled down from the north, rattling rigging and whipping sails. The sea heaved, then calmed, revealing a pathway deep enough for laden triremes. Sailors rushed to hoist canvas, their cries of triumph echoing off limestone cliffs. The sacrifice was complete. The price paid. Yet not all rejoiced. Achilles knelt beside the altar, head bowed in silent fury. A single tear traced a line through his helmet's grime. In every heart grief mingled with relief. Agamemnon watched the shifting waves, craving vengeance upon Troy but plagued by regret at the cost. Within hours, the fleet slipped anchor and set course across a shimmering olive-green sea. Leandros, now a legionary's apprentice, gazed back at Aulis' shores, trying to commit every cove and station to memory. Ileona, standing behind Troy's outer walls, had heard of the sacrifice through a fleeing courier. She clutched a lion-tooth amulet, whispering prayers to Artemis for mercy on Iphigenia's soul, and for the safety of all who sailed. The crossing took days, each sunrise revealing a horizon speckled with prows. Acronauts, the first lookout, sounded the alarm when the indistinct form of Troy's towers shimmered into view. On deck, dust from pressed wheat and spilled olive oil mixed underfoot. Hennas dyed the hulls with swirling wave patterns, an ancient sign of protection. Sailors coiled ropes with deft fingers, chanting old sea shanties to steady their nerves. Movies condensed these events into terse lines. We must appease the goddess and gloss over the human anguish that underpin the sacrifice. They show breezy winds filling sails the instant blood touches the altar, as if divine wills were easily negotiated. But the truth was harsher. A young girl's life weighed against 1,000 lives of soldiers, families torn between duty and compassion, friendships strained by the knowledge of what had been done. The Iliad would later immortalize Iphigenia's sacrifice as a tragic prelude, an episode only hinted at in Homer's verse. Yet no poet can fully capture the trembling hands that held the blade, the tremor in Agamemnon's voice, or the way the wind carried the scent of blood across the waters of Aulis. As the armada approached Troad's shores, omens abounded. Dolphins leaped alongside the prows, circling them as if warning or guiding. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mingling with the flapping of sails. The city's silhouette grew sharper. Crenellated walls atop craggy heights, the Scaean gate flanked by portholes for archers. Ileona stood with Priam and Hecuba on the ramparts. Priam's voice was grave. "They come for blood and spoils, not merely for Helen," he said, tracing a finger along the stone battlement. "This sacrifice will haunt them, fueling their fury." Hecuba clutched her pendant of Aphrodite, murmuring prayers for her lost granddaughter and for the fate of Troy. Chapter 4. Storming the Walls, Siege Warfare in the Late Bronze Age. A gray dawn broke over the plains of Ilium as the Greek camp stirred to life. Torches guttered in the wind. Soldiers rose from blankets of woven wool, their muscles stiff from nights spent under the open sky. Mycenaean chariot riders paced on the packed earth, reins jingling as they waited for orders. Beyond them, the great walls of Troy stood unbroken. Rising 40 feet from the plain, built of massive ashlar blocks quarried from nearby hills, their seams so tight that even a blade's edge could not slip between them. Flanked by towering bastions and crowned with battlements, those walls had repelled invaders for generations. Today, they would face the mightiest army the Eastern Mediterranean had ever seen. Troy's defenses were the envy of late Bronze Age architects. The city sat atop two hills, the Acropolis to the south, where Priam's palace gleamed white in sunlight, and the North Citadel, where granaries and workshops stored grain, oil, and weapons. Between them lay a double line of curtain walls, an inner barrier 18 feet thick and an outer wall 12 feet thick, linked by towers every 60 feet. From these heights, archers could fire arrows in deadly volleys. Defenders could roll stones, pour boiling pitch, or hurl javelins at assailants below. Inside the city, civilians and soldiers alike moved along raised walkways behind crenellations. Tunnel-like passages connected wall towers to the inner sanctum, allowing warriors to shift quickly from one front to another. Fresh water flowed through stone-lined channels from a spring on Mount Ida, ensuring the city could endure a long siege. Storehouses held barley and wheat sufficient for months. Oil jars lined shelves in cool vaulted chambers. When news of the Greek armada reached Troy, its gates were closed and barred, and every able-bodied man and woman took up arms or prepared provisions. Among the defenders was Eup, a young daughter of a prominent potter. She had grown up watching her father shape clay into amphory-bearing ocean-wave designs. Now she stood on the inner wall with a basket of sling stones at her feet, leather pouch slung across her shoulder. Each morning she unloosened the cord of her sling and let a smooth river pebble whistle between her fingers, aiming for the bronze helmets of Greek spearmen. Nearby, veteran archer Thersander knocked bronze-tipped arrows in rapid succession, his keen eyes picking out officers on the plain. Together, they formed part of a defense network conceived over centuries, ready to withstand every tactic their foes might deploy. The Mycenaeans responded with a series of probes and assaults designed to test Trojan resilience. Under cover of darkness, squads of spearmen crept to the base of the walls. They carried portable ladders, wooden frames lashed with rope, hoping to find weak points or unguarded sections. When a tower's guard changed shift, Greek climbers lunged upward, their hands gripping rough stone. But Trojan watchmen, perched above, spotted the glint of bronze under moonlight. A shrill horn sounded. Torchlight flared. sending defenders rushing to beat back the attackers with shields and spears. By day, siege engines rumbled across the plain. Sappers from Rhodes and Crete constructed wooden battering rams reinforced with bronze sheathing at the head. These rams, carried on wheels and suspended by thick ropes, targeted gatehouses and lower wall segments, aiming to break through the strong gates of timber and bronze. Behind the rams, shield-bearers marched in tight formation, a testudo of interlocking bronze shields meant to protect ram crews from arrows and boiling oil. Yet every advance was met with stony resistance. Archers on the walls rained arrows in deadly showers, stone-droppers released massive boulders, and pitch-wielding defenders poured searing liquid onto attackers below. The plain became a churn of dust and blood. Charioteers thundered across open ground, seeking to flank Trojan detachments that sallied forth in small groups. Mycenaean light infantry, armed with long spears and round shields, formed triangular wedges to smash through loose lines. Yet the terrain, rickety stone outcroppings, sun-cracked gullies and sunk carts, hampered cavalry charges and chariot maneuvers. Every foot of ground gained cost lives. Every step forward was paid for in iron shod. Sandals, torn garments, and the anguished cries of wounded men. Where brute force failed, cunning took its place. Greek commanders employed feigned retreats to lure Trojan defenders into traps. Hophman of Messenia, a battle-hardened chief with a scar across his left cheek, orchestrated a staged withdrawal near the Scaean gate. His men broke ranks, abandoning weapons mid-fight, then ran toward the camp as though pursued, teasing shouts and oaths carried over the walls, until Trojan warriors, believing victory at hand, surged from the gates. Hidden behind low hills, Hophman's reserves closed in, encircling the eager defenders. In the ensuing skirmish, dozens of Trojans fell before the gates swung shut behind them. Night raids became another weapon. Small bands of prowlers, dressed in dark cloaks, slipped through narrow crevices in the outer wall. Places too narrow for a ladder but just wide enough for a man's body. Like shadows, they moved along the parapets, silently sawing at braces that held the inner gate shut. Sparks flew as bronze tools bit into iron pins, minute by minute undermining the gate's integrity. If successful, the gate would collapse under its own weight at dawn, providing a sudden breach. Yet the risk was high. One clatter of bronze or choke of cough could spark alarms and strand raiders between two walls with no path of return. Greek spies also tried to bribe insider workers, stonemasons, water carriers, even women who washed clothes within the city. They passed rings and trinkets through crevices in the walls, hoping for secret hints at patrol schedules or weak mortar joints. But Trojan loyalty held firm. Priests had warned of divine retribution for betraying the city, and many civilians feared sacrilege more than death at the hands of Greek swords. Behind the walls, life continued in a suspended breath. Families stored precious oil in clay amphorae sealed with wax. They huddled in vaulted cellars when the rumble of siege engines shook the battlements. Children like Iliona's niece, Arisbe, learned to fetch water in jars while dodging showers of pebble fire. She clutched a torch as she ran beneath damp arches, praying to Apollo to guide her steps. Farms in the plains were abandoned. Olive groves lay unharvested. Grain fields were trodden by troops, and villages outside the walls fell silent. In one courtyard near the East Tower, an elderly spinner named Marina sobbed as she unraveled a tapestry embroidered with scenes of Trojan festivals. Her hands trembled, the golden threads slipping through her calloused fingers. She whispered prayers to Athena, begging for the safety of her grandchildren, who slept fitfully on mats laid out beneath stone arches. Priam's palace, too, felt the strain. Hecuba kept jars of barley porridge warm for returning soldiers. She moved from room to room, offering healing salves for splintered bones and binding wounds with linen strips. In the temple garden, wounds of the heart ran deeper. Priam himself paced between marble columns, hearing each report with grim silence. He wept when children cried for mothers, and when warriors stumbled in with missing limbs. Week after week, the siege ground on. The Greek camp grew crowded. Tents sprang up like fields of pale mushrooms, stinking of sweat, blood, and animal hides. Rats and fleas multiplied in the filth. Dysentery claimed more lives than bronze swords. Soldiers knelt in prayer as supply ships arrived with bread, barley, and vinegar. They traded wine for cheese at makeshift markets. They bartered carved combs for dried figs, but each dawn brought renewed assaults, renewed defiance, and renewed cost. In one desperate attempt to breach the inner wall, Greek engineers built a towering wooden siege tower, 40 feet high, bristling with spikes, and covered in hides to resist fire arrows. They rolled it into place under cover of a stormy night. As thunder rumbled, Menelaus himself climbed to the top, holding a torch to light burning branches attached to the tower's walls. He planned to press the tower against the inner wall and pour flames over, but Trojan watchmen spotted the silhouette, and a rain of arrows pinned Menelaus atop the tower. With cries of agony, he leapt, or was he thrown, from the burning structure, his scarlet cloak aflame. Guards retrieved his body at dawn, carrying it back beneath a banner of mourning. That day, the Trojan defenses held firm, and a collective cheer rose from the walls. Yet tears flowed among families who recognized the fallen king, and fear cut deep at the knowledge that even a hero's death could not halt the siege. Hollywood often portrays siege warfare as swift. One dramatic breach, one heroic charge, the city falls. They compress months into minutes, omit the crawling dread of waiting under constant arrow fire, and show attackers leaping effortlessly over walls as though gravity were optional. They cast siege towers as unstoppable engines of doom, when in truth they moved at a snail's pace and were vulnerable to fire, undermining, or trebuchet bombs, none of which survived in Homeric verse but appear in later Hellenistic accounts. Films tend to focus on shining heroes, Achilles lunging at Hector, Ajax lifting boulders, Paris firing arrows with impossible accuracy. Yet they ignore the nameless laborers who toiled on rams and siege towers, the civilians who scavenged mortar from collapsed gates, and the spies who slipped through hidden posterns. They disregard the diseases that spread through camps, the desertion of weary soldiers, and the diplomatic jockeying that threatened to derail the entire campaign when Greek chieftains argued over spoils, credit, and command. By autumn, a subtle shift emerged. Trojan supplies dwindled as autumn storms battered their walls and cut off supply convoys. Grain reserves ran low. Water in the upper cisterns turned brackish. Opposite them, the Greek camp, though ravaged by disease, received fresh grain and wine from Messenian and Cretan ships. Agamemnon offered generous rations to chariot drivers and foot soldiers, tempered only by the fear that a full throng of siege engines would collapse the walls. Achilles, fresh from skirmishes on the plains, proposed a calculated sally. He argued that a combined chariot and infantry charge at the South Tower might overrun the defenders and create a breach. The plan required precise timing, chariot drivers to distract archers, while shield-bearers formed a wedge beneath the wall. Priests in both camps predicted omens. A double rainbow, an owl screeching thrice at dusk, and a sudden flock of pelicans diving offshore. Calchas interpreted these signs as favoring the attackers, but only if they moved swiftly and decisively. The real story of Troy's siege is not of invulnerability nor inevitable fall. It is of grinding pressure, of ingenuity countered by steadfast defense, and of an interplay between environment, technology, and human will. The ashlar blocks that repelled battering rams still stand today in Turkey's Hazarlik site, testament to Bronze Age engineering prowess. The deep water harbors and hidden posterns reveal a city designed for endurance, not just show. As modern viewers, we look for climactic battles, crowning moments, and the grand sacrifice of heroes. Yet in Troy's siege, the drama lay in attrition. In each dawn that brought renewed assaults, in each night spent whispering prayers in cramped tunnels, in each ration of barley soup shared quietly among brothers in arms. It was a war of patience as much as strength, a testament to the lengths men and women would go to protect home, honor, and hope. Chapter 5: Heroes and Human Cost. The morning sun rose pale and uncertain over the plain of Ilium, as if even Helios himself hesitated to cast full light on the carnage below. The air still carried the tang of blood and burnt pitch from the previous night's skirmishes, smoke drifting like a stubborn memory along the empty fields. Amid this hush, two figures stood apart from the massed ranks of warriors. Achilles, the greatest of the Achaeans, and Hector, Troy's proudest defender. Each carried the weight of countless lives on his shoulders, yet neither could know the full price they would pay, nor the human stories woven through every bronze-clad clash. Achilles, son of Peleus, was renowned for his prodigious strength and peerless skill with the spear. Bards sang of his near-superhuman prowess, how he cleaved shields in two and sent chariots reeling with a single thrust. Yet behind the legend lay a man torn by obligation, rage, and the fear of a fate foretold. Before dawn, Achilles paced alone in his tent, its flaps still dark with the soot of torches extinguished hours ago. The wind rattled the canvas, carrying the distant sound of hoofbeats as reinforcements approached. Achilles' bronze greaves lay side by side like silent sentinels. He ran calloused fingers over the raised lion's head embossed on his breastplate. The image reminded him of naught but a cage, an armor as much a prison as protection. He thought of Patroclus, his closest companion, asleep in the tent beside him. Their bond was famed among the Greeks. Two souls entwined by loyalty, sharing hopes, fears, and the small comforts of home. An earthenware cup of wine, the scratch of a lyre string, the steady rhythm of or against oar. Achilles glanced at Patroclus's sleeping face, peaceful in the dim light. He feared that every battle might be their last moment of peace. Outside, the first rays of sunlight revealed a battlefield strewn with helmets, shields, and broken spears. Fallen men lay forgotten, their faces masked by dust and dried blood. Achilles felt a pang of guilt for the dozens he had slain during the previous day's cavalry charge. Youths who screamed the moment bronze met bone, their voices swallowed by the roar of war. He recalled how, in the silence that followed the clash, he had knelt beside a dying Myrmidon, pressed a flask of vinegar to his cracked lips, and heard him whisper a hopeless prayer for home. That plea, "Tell my mother I loved her," echoed in Achilles' mind as he strained to remember the man's name. When Patroclus stirred, Achilles roused him with a gentle shake. "The sun climbs," he said, voice low. "Today, we press against the Scaean gate. Will you ride with me?" Patroclus sat up, eyes bright with resolute calm. "I will," he replied, strapping on his bronze greaves. "Where you go, I follow." Achilles placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. a gesture of both gratitude and dread, knowing that on this day, one of them might not return. On the walls of Troy, Hector stood among the city's defenders, his broad shoulders stiff beneath a cuirass of beaten bronze. The dawn light played on his corselet, casting fiery reflections onto the stone walkway. Below, families huddled in cellars. Children wept softly as mothers whispered prayers to Athena and Apollo. The sight steeled Hector's resolve. He fought not for glory, but for those he loved. Earlier that morning, Hecuba and Andromache had visited him in the palace's inner chambers. Andromache pressed a soft hand against Hector's arm, her fingers slipping under the leather strap of his sword belt. She offered him a bronze ring inscribed with their son's name, Scamandrios, begging him to wear it close to his heart. "Return to me," she whispered. "Return for him." Hector kissed her forehead, the gold of her hair catching torchlight. He memorized her trembling face, knowing that this image might be the last he carried into battle. Priam, their aged father, laid a hand on Hector's shoulder. "My son," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Troy looks to you. Hold firm, and the city endures." Hector nodded, swallowing pride and fear. He donned his helmet, a shining Corinthian helm plumed with horsehair, and stepped onto the ramparts. Below, lines of spearmen formed like a ripple in the sea. Bows were strung, and javelins readied. Hector raised his spear in salute, meeting the gaze of each man and woman who lifted eyes to him. They were the living tapestry of Troy. Farmers, potters, weavers, foreign mercenaries, and enslaved laborers who had found purpose in defending their adopted home. Beyond the spotlight cast on Achilles and Hector, countless unsung figures shaped the battle's tide. Women labored through the night in Presley's courtyard, weaving armor cloaks encrusted with bronze discs to protect shield-bearers on the front lines. Each disc was hammered by hand, polished until it gleamed. Their fingers bled and blistered, yet they whispered blessings into each knot and stitch, as though infusing the metal with prayers. In Troy's hidden postern, a group of Lycians, foreign allies skilled in mountainous guerrilla tactics, prepared a secret sortie. They gathered behind a low wall, scanning the Achaean camp for signs of movement. Their leader, Sarpedon, recalled how he had once raided Greek villages as part of an Anatolian warband. Now he fought with Troy's defenders, his loyalty sealed by gifts of gold and by the memory of peaceful markets shattered by this war. Each Lycian's arrow was not only a weapon but a message that Troy's struggle had drawn in the fates of far-flung allies. At the Mycenaean forward base, slaves captured at sea labored to fetch water and wood. They carried heavy amphorae from shallow wells and dragged felled timber to fuel cooking fires and forge weapons. One such slave, a young man named Dorion, had once hailed from Miletus. He knew the taste of the sea breeze and the sight of home's whitewashed walls. Now he moved silently under the olive trees of Aulis's outskirts, lest he catch the eye of an Achaean captain whose cruelty he might incite. Dorion's hands were strong. He could fashion a spear haft or a basket of arrows with equal skill, but he longed for the day he might slip back beyond enemy lines, guided by clandestine notes he had sewn into his tunic. By mid-morning, Achilles positioned his myrmidons in a tight phalanx before the Scaean gate. Spears in raised formation, shields locked together, they advanced in an unbroken line. Behind them, chariots circled to harass defenders, their wheels kicking up pale dust. Achilles' approach was heralded by the beat of war, drums, and the rhythmic chant of grease-slick rowers who had marched ashore just hours before. On the walls, Hector observed the formation with grim concentration. He marshaled a counterforce of archers and slingers at the parapet's highest point. while spearmen formed a reinforcements line behind. At Zlatan's bastion, Yup took her position. Sling cocked, I trained on Achilles' shield crest. Thersander, the veteran archer, stood beside her, fist gripping arrows fletched with turkey feathers. Each had learned to aim for the exposed throat guard or the narrow gap between cuirass and helmet, a tiny target yet often lethal. As Achilles' phalanx closed, javelins sang through the air, bronze points whistling toward unshielded limbs. Yup let fly first, stone meeting shield with a dull thud. Thersander followed, arrow embedding in the gem-bright metal of a myrmidon's cuirass. The man staggered, crumpled under the weight of his armor, and lay still. Achilles paused, scanning the parapet above. When he spotted Hector's gleaming helmet crest, his blood boiled. He raised his spear and hurled it, a spinning missile of bronze. The spear struck the wall mere inches from Hector's foot, splintering one of the stones. Dust fell like gray snow. At that signal, Achaean trumpets blared. Achilles led the charge, his bronze shield flashing in the sun. Myrmidons surged forward, scaling ladders rattling against the stones. Below, Greek foot soldiers battered at the lower gate with hammers and rams, trying to rip iron hinges from worn sockets. The ground shook with every impact. Hector leapt over the battlement, spear in hand. He met Achilles' gaze across the narrowing space. Their eyes locked in a duel of wills. With a cry, Hector hurled his spear. Achilles, shield braced, deflected it with a clang that set muscles trembling. Achilles countered with a thrust aimed high, but Hector twisted aside, blades scraping the stone as he slipped past. His men poured through the breach, engaging Myrmidons in vicious swordplay amid overturned jars and shattered pottery shards. Amid the clash, the field surgeons moved like phantoms, weaving between bodies on both sides. They carried baskets of sharpened scissors, strips of linen, clay pots filled with herbal poultices, and small lamps dripping with olive oil, soaked wicks. Their work was urgent, surgical. Bone saws cut off shattered limbs, cautery irons seared wounds to stem blood, and poultices of crushed yarrow were bound to lacerations. One such surgeon, Olinos, had once been a scribe in Troy's archives. The war's toll had driven him to learn battlefield medicine from temple priests. Now he crouched beside a young Greek warrior whose spear had pierced his thigh. Olinos cleared the wound of cloth and dirt, applied a plaster of honey and ground barley to prevent infection, then guided a fresh bandage around the injured limb. Blood mixed with honey in a sticky red paste that shone in the midday glare. The warrior gripped Olinos' shoulder, lips white, eyes full of gratitude and pain. Nearby, a Greek physician named Helen of Aulis attended to a Trojan archer blinded by a blunt stone. Helen's voice was calm as he rinsed the man's torn eyelid with wine, its alcohol acting as antiseptic, then doused a poultice of mint and crushed poppies to dull the agony. The archer moaned, choking back tears, but Helen remained steady, as though no sound could distract him from his task. These healers worked with no regard for lines drawn in the dirt. They sought only to save life, or at least mitigate suffering. While the rivers of blood flowed on either side of the battered bog, their instruments were crude by later standards, but their compassion was boundless, offering small mercy amid the vast cruelty of Bronze Age war. By afternoon, the Scaean gate lay in smoldering ruins. Achilles' men poured into the breach, their yells rising above the clash of bronze. Hector's line wavered, then pressed back, only to reform and counterattack amid the debris. Both sides took heavy losses. The ground was churned to mud by spilled oil and blood. Broken weapons lay mixed with abandoned shields. Achilles caught sight of Patroclus, spear raised, fighting beside Myrmidons who had wounded their captain. Patroclus drove his blade through the ribs of a Trojan soldier, then paused, chest heaving, to shield a fallen comrade from a volley of arrows. Achilles charged forward, scattering enemy archers with a flurry of blows, then knelt to help his weary friend to his feet. They withdrew together, backs to one another, swords ready to meet any attacker. In those moments, the legend of Achilles and Patroclus, two warriors inseparable in valor, was etched in fire and steel. On the walls, Eup had exhausted her supply of sling stones. She hurled her leather pouch like a javelin, striking a myrmidon in the forehead. Another stone stung her arm, tearing through linen and skin. She fell to one knee, blood trickling down her forearm. Thersander caught her before she collapsed, pressing a strip of clean linen over the wound. "We hold," he said, "for Troy." Eup nodded, her face pale but resolute. She raised the sling again. Movies often depict Achilles as an unerring demigod, blessing every thrust and twice triumphant. They show Hector as a noble paragon, doomed by fate but unstoppable until the final clash. Yet the real heroes of Troy's siege were neither flawless nor infallible. Achilles hesitated when Patroclus fell ill from infection weeks later. Hector balked before the breach of a secondary gate, fearing a trap. Both men felt fear's icy grip. Both experienced the agony of wounds that would never fully heal. And beyond them, hundreds of unnamed fighters endured shattered arms, concussions from mace blows, infections from untreated wounds, and the lingering nightmares of friends crushed under falling walls. They knew hunger when supply lines were cut. They knew cold when winter's chill seeped through armor. They knew despair when comrades deserted or gave in to madness. Yet each morning, they wiped sweat and soot from their brows, strapped on greaves, and returned to the walls or to the plain, driven by oaths, by duty, or by the faint hope that this day might bring peace. As dusk settled, the battlefield fell silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of small fires. Warriors on both sides gathered their dead, laying them in shallow trenches to be claimed at dawn. Achilles walked the line, offering handfuls of barley and crumbs of bread to survivors. He knelt before a young Trojan boy, weeping beside his mother, and pressed a flask of water into her hand. "For your child," he said softly. The woman nodded, lips trembling. "Tell my daughter I loved her." She echoed the dying words Achilles had once heard. Hector remained on the walls, watching Greek campfires glimmer like scattered stars. He clasped the bronze ring Andromache had given him and prayed that the war might end soon, before more names were added to the long list of the missing. He massaged a bruise on his ribs, a gift from Achilles' spear on the parapet, but the ache in his side felt hollow compared to the pain in his heart. Chapter 6. The Trojan Horse Revealed. As dawn's pale light filtered through the morning mist, Ileona pressed her forehead against the cool stone of Troy's northern wall and stared down at an impossible sight. Where scorched earth and battered siege engines had lain silent for hours, now stood a towering shape carved of polished oak. Its flanks gleamed with bead-like rivets, and its hollow belly yawned wide, as though inviting the city's defenders to peer inside. Never had Ileona seen craftsmanship so grand, or felt such a chill of foreboding in her chest. Overnight, the Greeks had erected a monument that seemed equal parts tribute and trap, and in its silent presence lay the promise of a peril she could scarcely imagine. Word of the wooden giant flew through the streets in ragged whispers. Mothers paused at the market stalls, jars of oil clutched in their arms, eyes wide with fearful curiosity. Children darted after one another, daring each other to run beneath the horse's belly, giggling until a priest's stern voice cut through their laughter. Even Priam, haggard from weeks of sleepless nights, ordered his chariot halted beside the horse's massive haunches and studied the smooth carvings as if they held a secret code. The polished planks were seamless, the grain flowing around painted eyes that seemed almost alive. A frieze of warriors in bas relief marched along the creature's body, their spears pointing skyward in a silent salute. Iliona's heart twisted as she realized the irony. A symbol of war fashioned in the shape of an animal sacred to victory and peace. Soon, a hush fell over the crowd as Sinan, the Greek left behind, was dragged forward by two silent guards. He was gaunt and wild-eyed, his tunic stained with salt and blood, yet he carried himself with the air of a man who knew his words would shape destiny. With a trembling voice, he spun his tale. How he had fled the jealous wrath of Agamemnon, been saved by Trojan hands, and now returned as living proof that the wooden horse was an offering to Athena, to placate her anger at desecrated temples and to seal a peace the Greeks desperately desired. He spoke of divine omens, that an oracle had declared only this gift would win the goddess's favor and guarantee a lasting truce. Sinan's words fell over the assembly like gentle rain, soothing their fears even as a distant drumbeat of impending doom rumbled in Iliona's bones. As Sinan wove his carefully crafted plea, Iliona remembered the stories of her grandmother, whispered late at night in oil-lit chambers. She recalled tales of ritual effigies paraded through Anatolian cities, symbols meant to carry prayers skyward before being ritually dismantled. A small voice in her mind wondered whether the horse was simply a borrowed tradition, a real tribute misunderstood by hearts sharpened for war. Yet the crowds around her grew restless, eyes shining with hope that the long siege might finally end without further bloodshed. Priests in saffron robes lined up before the horse, murmuring blessings and casting barley into its gaping maw. Iliona shivered at the sight, remembering how every grain she had scattered in prayer once fed the inner fires of Troy's hearths, and now fell silent in stone. Men crowded the walls, debating whether to haul the horse inside or leave it outside as an unblessed curse. Hecuba pleaded for caution, her voice quavering as she recalled the cruel twists of fate that had haunted Troy's past. "Let us test it," she urged, "with fire or by tearing at its panels." But others feared that any damage would anger the gods anew. A chorus of voices rose and fell, until finally the decision tipped toward celebration. Trumpets blared from the ramparts, and a dozen oxen were slaughtered at the city gates in a feast of thanksgiving. Iliona watched as the gates slowly swung open, iron hinges creaking like the breath of some great beast reluctantly stirred from slumber. With solemn steps, priests guided the horse into the inner courtyard, while her brother, Deiphobus, and other guards formed a line of shields to protect the procession. Every foot of ground that polished timber crossed felt heavy with portent. Night fell soft and still, a velvet cloak over streets no longer echoing with the clang of siege engines. Inside the walls, torches flickered, casting wavering shadows that played across the horse's carved muscles. Iliona wandered past columned arcades toward the palace, where faint strains of lyre music drifted from a celebratory feast. She paused beneath an arch, lingering on the smell of roasting lamb and spiced wine, a scent once sweet but now tinged with dread. She thought of the stories, snippets of Hittite envoys' letters and local ballads, speaking of secret tunnels and bribed sentries, of gates opened from within. Her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. She wanted desperately to believe this was a triumph of diplomacy, a moment of peace earned at last. But every instinct in her body screamed that this gift, this horse, was the harbinger of Troy's fall. In the dead of night, when even the guards on the walls dozed in shifts, A low creak traveled through the courtyard. Ileona, roused by a distant groan of wood, crept toward the horse. The moon's silver light glinted off metal bands securing the planks. She knelt close and pressed her hand against the grain, feeling a faint vibration, as though something stirred inside. A breath escaped her lips. Could that be the heartbeat of the city's doom? Behind her, the faint rustle of cloak fabric betrayed a hidden presence. She spun, heart pounding, and caught sight of a figure darting into shadow. Perhaps a Trojan guard testing the structure, or perhaps a Greek spy slipping through the night like a phantom. Ileona swallowed hard, torn between the urge to cry out and the need to stay silent. By the time the city slept in utter stillness, the horse stood in its massive solitude, a silent sentinel in a sleeping fortress. Outside, the Greek ships lay motionless beyond the harbor's curve, their rowers huddled in wet cloaks, waiting for the signal. Somewhere on the plain, a torch flame winked through low portholes carved into the base of the horse. The oarsmen had returned, inching their vessels back into position under cover of trees, preparing to land the hidden army once the gates opened again. Ileona, unable to tear her eyes from the horse, felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, watching a shape shift in the periphery of her vision. She knew that when morning broke, Troy would not be the same. At dawn's first light, a distant horn sounded low, mournful, and urgent. Ileona raced for the walls as alarm bells rang out. Soldiers poured into the streets, grabbing spears and shields from racks near the gates. Priests shrieked prayers to Artemis, to Athena, to any power that might avert disaster. As she reached the northern rampart, Ileona saw gates of the inner wall being forced open, not by battering ram or sappers, but by Trojan guards themselves. Men standing in the portholes of the horse, forcing bolt locks with grim resolve. Above them, the city gates clambered open as the Greeks surged in, lanterns bobbing like fallen stars moving through the shadowed alleys. The defenders barely had time to grasp the truth before chaos exploded in every quarter. The clash was swift and terrible. Spears crashed against shields, torches lit the night in angry tongues, and the high walls, once symbols of security and pride, rang with the echoes of betrayal. Ileona fought through panicked crowds, parrying blows and helping wounded women breathe through shallow gasps. She grabbed her brother Deiphobus's arm as he charged into the fray, his young face set in fierce determination. Wood splintered, and flames leapt along the galleries, painting the walls, gold and orange. The wooden horse burned from within, stoking the fires above as its sacrificial form became the instrument of its own destruction. By dawn's second hour, Troy lay in ruin. Smoke curled in gray ribbons above collapsed roofs, and the acrid tang of burning timber choked the air. Survivors staggered through streets littered with fallen shields and broken pottery, calling names that went unanswered. Ileona sank to her knees beside a shattered amphora, the horse's timbers smoldering at her feet. She wept for her parents, for the artisans and priests, for the future she had never lived to see. Deiphobus knelt beside her, his sword still clutched in his hand, eyes vacant with grief and fury. In that ruined courtyard, Achilles himself strode forward amid his myrmidons, bronze gleaming, cloak stained with ash. He paused beside Ileona and lifted his helmet's visor. Their eyes met across the devastation, her soaked with tears, his steady with the weight of the city's fate. He offered her a hand-bound flask of water, the first act of compassion amid the wreckage. Ileona took it with trembling fingers, feeling the cool ceramic against her palm. In that moment, she saw not a monster of war, but a man burdened by a victory he had never wanted. When the survivors gathered for cleansing rites amid crumbling pillars and sunken altars, they spoke not of the wooden horse as a marvel of cunning, but as a warning whispered through generations, that what is presented as a gift may conceal ruin, and that the greatest defenses can be undone from within. The horse's timbers were torn down, burned for firewood, and buried under rubble. Yet its memory lived on in songs, in warnings carved into tombstones, and in the hearts of those who escaped the conflagration. For centuries, travelers would point to Troy's ruins and whisper of that night when a city's pride became the instrument of its own undoing. Chapter 7: Aftermath and Enduring Myths. When the fires finally died down and the acrid smoke lifted from Troy's shattered walls, a haunting silence fell over the ruined city. Survivors stumbled from hiding places in cellars and collapsed halls, blinking against the sun's harsh light. They found themselves amid a landscape of broken pottery, smoldering timbers, and empty granaries. The grain stores where Iliona's family once kept jars of oil and barley were reduced to rubble, and the great cisterns that had promised water through any siege lay clogged with fallen masonry. In the streets, bodies lay still beneath torn cloaks and tarnished armor, the faces of Mycenaean conquerors and Trojan defenders frozen in final expressions of terror or resolve. For those who remained, the reality of defeat sank into their bones. The city they had known, the home they had defended for generations, was gone. Amid the ruins, the handful of survivors gathered in small, trembling clusters. Iliona, her hair matted with ash, wandered among the fallen, calling her grandmother's name until her voice gave out, Deiphobus. His sword still in hand, guided elderly neighbors toward the lower gates, now crumbled and overgrown with weeds. Some refugees shouldered battered infants. Others carried what little silver and bronze they could salvage. They moved as if half in a dream, haunted by the echoes of weapons clashing in the night. Even the birds that nested in the olive groves seemed hesitant to return, as though the land itself recoiled from the memory of blood. Beyond the city's threshold, the plains of Ilium stretched empty under a cloudless sky. There, Greek ships waited at the edge of the harbor, their bow ramps lowered and oars at rest. Many captains offered quarter to those who emerged unarmed. Achilles himself stood on a landing stage, cloak stained with ash, and signaled his myrmidons to allow elderly women and children to pass. He knew that mercy now would cast a gentler light on a victory won at such terrible cost. Yet not all Greeks shared his restraint. Bands of soldiers prowled nearby ruins, searching for hidden treasures or keeping watch on anyone who dared to smile. The city of Troy lay in the balance between compassion and conquest, its fate entrusted to the choices of victors as well as vanquished. Those who escaped by sea found refuge in scattered Aegean ports and coastal enclaves. Iliona joined a small flotilla of merchant vessels bound for Thrace, her brother Deiphobus at her side. They carried with them rags of tapestry and a fragment of clay tablet inscribed with Homeric verse, a book Iliona's mother had once recited under the moon. As they sailed north, she looked back at the smoking silhouette of Troy's Acropolis and wondered whether the city would ever rise again. Along the way, they encountered other refugees. Families from Lesbos huddled on deck, Cretan artisans cradling broken lyres, and Anatolian peasants carrying sacks of barley saved from the fields. Each group brought its own stories of loss and survival, scattering Troy's traditions like seeds on distant shorelines. In the years that followed, these refugees became the architects of new communities. On the island of Lemnos, they founded a settlement they named Neo-Troy, or New Troy, drawing on collective memory to rebuild what had been lost. Traders bearing Trojan craftwork, pottery painted with war scenes, bronze figurines of warriors and gods, established markets in Sparta and Miletus, weaving Trojan motifs into Aegean art. Lycians who had fought alongside Hector returned to Anatolian hills and carved reliefs depicting the siege on temple facades. In each new home, the story of Troy lived on not as a single, burned city, but as a tapestry of places and people bound by shared exile. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, the Greek nostoi, or returns, began in earnest. Agamemnon's fleet dispersed after dividing the spoils of war, but homecoming proved no less perilous than the siege itself. Many ships foundered in storms off Mycenae and Corinth, and crews perished when wind and wave proved fiercer than Trojan walls. Menelaus, whose fury had once driven the campaign, faced betrayal at his own palace. Stories tell of Clytemnestra's vengeance for Iphigenia's sacrifice. Nestor returned to Pylos, his gray hair bristling with grief for comrades lost. His wisdom and later counsels would shape the legends of the heroic age. Even Achilles, whose rage had mounted at Patroclus's death, met his end in Phthia, struck down by a mortal arrow guided by Apollo. His story, too, became part of the tapestry woven by bards and scribes. Across the Mediterranean, Troy's fall resonated in the courts of kings and the halls of poets. Hittite scribes recorded the collapse of a key ally, Wilusa, in diplomatic letters to Egypt. Egyptian pharaohs noted the influx of Mycenaean wares, fine pottery and weapons, into coastal markets, recognizing the reshaped political map of the Aegean. On Cyprus, islanders carved visages of Priam and Hector into ivory panels, romanticizing the doomed defenders for merchants who asked only for stories, more than goods. In each of these places, travelers carried fragmented tales of a wooden horse, of secret tunnels, and of a city undone by its own hospitality. Over decades, those fragments grew into coherent myths, legends that prized drama over nuance, heroes over civilians, and divine will over human choice. The bards of Argos and Sparta polished these tales into epic verse, expanding on Homer's two poems and adding scenes of gods quarreling on Olympus. Their audiences flocked to hear of Achilles' wrath and Hector's honor, of Trojan women lamenting behind locked doors and Greek ghosts drifting home. In the Achaean banquets, warriors toasted each other with wine cups stamped in the image of a horse, recalling the ultimate ruse that had brought even the mightiest walls to heel. Painters on ceramic amphory depicted Achilles dragging Hector's corpse, Greeks pouring molten lead into Trojan treasure vaults, and Helen's tear-streaked face looking back in despair. With each telling, the story grew larger, more fearsome, more wondrous, and the real Troy receded behind layers of legend. Yet not all memories became myth. In secret rites among Trojan descendants on Lesbos, people still carried tokens of the city. A fallen shard from the Scaean gate, a brass fitting from a submerged ram head, or a scrap of olive wood painted in bas-relief. They recited hymns older than Homer, songs of Ilion before the siege, of olive harvests and weddings, of workshops humming with potters' wheels and chariots racing across open fields. These recollections kept alive a Troy that was not only a battlefield but a place of daily life, of commerce, art, and devotion. In hidden corners of temples, priests preserved fragments of clay tablets and inscribed them with prayers to gods who had once favored the city. Over the centuries, empires rose and fell around Troy's ruins. Lydian kings, Persian satraps, Macedonian conquerors, and Roman governors each left their mark. Yet pilgrims still journeyed to the Mount of Hazarlik, pointing to the massive ashlar blocks of level 7A and whispering that here lay the bones of a city whose story had shaped Western civilization. excavations in the modern age revealed charred layers, sapped foundations, and hordes of bronze and gold, material proof of a war once thought purely legendary. Archaeologists stood on the same ground where Ileona had wept, where Achilles had offered water to war-torn survivors, and they marveled at how myth and history had intertwined so deeply that separating them seemed impossible. Tonight, as we close the book on Troy's final chapter, we remember more than the fall of walls or the cunning of a wooden horse. We remember the faces of those who lived and died within those gates. Mothers clutching infants, artisans shaping fine wares, slaves carrying water at dawn, priests casting barley into fire. We recall the choices that turned peace offerings into vehicles of destruction, the oaths that bound men to war, and the fragile ties of mercy that shone even amid bloodshed. Troy's legacy endures not only in the epics of Homer and Virgil, but in every story of place and people uprooted by conflict. It lives on in our cautionary tales of gifts that conceal ruin, in our empathy for refugees who scatter like seeds, and in the belief that memory, however altered by time, remains the bridge between loss and understanding. As the final ashes settle on these pages, let us carry forward the true story of Troy, a tale of ingenuity and betrayal, of courage and heartbreak, of a city born from trade and song, and of human lives caught between honor and hope. And as our lights dim and our voices soften, remember that the greatest walls ever built can fall not only to battering rams but to the choices we make, the promises we honor or break, and the stories we choose to tell.